Thanks. That was a long introduction, but I also work for an institute with a very long name. So it's great to come after Peter. He had such a great presentation that, and he said many great things. So one of the things that he mentioned was this reliance on commissions and things like this for policy making in Denmark, and I think it works in some ways very similar in Sweden. And this institute that I work for is sort of a policy-oriented research institute that is really there to provide evaluations of the policy that the government is doing, which I think symbolizes in a way the reliance on science actually, and the great interest that Swedish politicians have in listening to science. They don't always do what we propose, of course, but they like to listen to what we say, which is a start at least, I guess. So I was asked to talk about youth unemployment in Sweden, so this is going to be much more precise and much more narrow focus than the previous talk. And I will not pretend that I know a whole lot about the situation in Latvia, but so what I will do is talk about the situation in Sweden. And this is not going to be a talk about how great things are in Sweden, and hopefully it will not also be a talk about how awful things are, but I'll try to give you a balanced view. But I hope you can see this figure. Yeah, it looks nice there. So this is a graph of the ratio of youth unemployment to adult unemployment in various OECD countries. Unfortunately, Latvia is not here, but the red dot up there is Sweden. And essentially what this tells you is that compared to other OECD countries, youth unemployment makes up a much higher fraction of unemployment in Sweden than in most other countries, right? And it's in many ways a remarkable outlier in this perspective. One way of thinking of this figure is that it tells you that both before the crisis and now, young people are sort of responsible or bearing the burden of a much higher fraction of unemployment than in other countries in Sweden. And if you would have the other Nordic countries here, they would be sort of distributed down here, where Finland would be the closest one to Sweden, but still further down, and Norway a little bit further than that, and then Denmark in the middle. So from this figure, it's sort of clear that there are challenges with youth unemployment in Sweden. But in other aspects, it doesn't look as bad, because this is the fraction of the unemployed young that are long-term unemployed. And here you can see that Sweden actually have, again, both before the crisis and now, a much lower share of long-term unemployed. So in that perspective, we have a lot of unemployment, but it seems to be concentrated more on the short-term unemployed. And this, again, is also more pronounced than in other Nordic countries. Here, you would see the other Nordic ones being sort of fairly close to Sweden, and the ones that are actually more extreme here, where there is more of long-term youth unemployment, are actually the countries in that were sort of in the former communist countries in general. Again, Latvia is not in that figure. If you look at who is actually long-term unemployed, you can see that there are pretty strong patterns here, that the ones that are overrepresented among these groups are the ones with poor formal education. And you could sort of slice this the way you like, but essentially dropping out of high school or having bad grades when you're 15 and things like this are really strong predictors of the risk of long-term unemployment. And there's also, of course, a big problem for immigrant youth in Sweden, in particular those who arrive at a relatively high age. And it seems that the thing that is not working well here is essentially the school-to-work transition, you could say, because what you see is that in a way which sort of sets Sweden apart from the rest of Europe and most OECD countries, is that once kids in Sweden leave school, they become inactive to a fairly large extent. And a lot of the unemployment spells that you see among young people, they start immediately after high school. So this sort of suggests that the transitions from school to work are not really working properly in Sweden. And you also see a really high fraction of youth on temporary contracts, which means that among those that are employed, a much higher fraction in Sweden than in most other countries are working on temporary contracts, which means that they don't have a permanent employment contract. And here you can see again that the situation before the crisis and after the crisis are essentially the same. And which is true for all of these three figures, which should tell you that a lot of the things that you see regarding how the youth labor markets work in different countries are in fact relatively stable, right? So the countries who do poorly in one dimension before the crisis also do so after the crisis. So there's some sort of permanent aspects that differs between countries. Some of these may be because of measurement issues and stuff like that, but I think there are other reasons for that. Here you could also see that the Nordic countries are actually distributed quite widely across this line, but Sweden again is sort of in the top. So I think overall the picture that you get from this is that what you would see on the Swedish youth labor market is that you have a lot of unemployed people. But in particular, you also have very few young people actually working on permanent contracts, because among those that are actually employed, a really high fraction are on temporary jobs. In fact, the majority of the the young people, I should say. So in a sense, you would see that you have a lot of people on short-term unemployment and a lot of people on temporary employment contracts. And in fact, if you look at the incidence of part-time employment, it's also very high among youth in Sweden. So what you can see that there's a big fraction among young people on the Swedish labor market that are sort of on the margin between unemployment and employment, but sort of, as it seems, going back and forth between very unstable short-term employment and unemployment without really going into full-time permanent employment, but not really being completely excluded from the labor market. So in that sense, the problem is there's sort of a mixture of whether we should think of this as a huge problem or not. But whereas there's certainly a fraction of the unemployed, in particular the low-educated, where we could think of this as being a more serious social problem. So this is sort of the state of things that we have. Now, so turning towards issues regarding policy, I just could think of two things. So one is, what do we do with those who are actually unemployed? And the other one would be sort of, where is the problems that we have, where are they coming from, and how could we prevent kids from, or young people to enter into this state of unemployment. So I will start from which is sort of the second stage of this process, which is how do we treat these people. So in terms of benefits, by which I mean financial payments to these young people, essentially what we do is we don't pay them actually a whole lot. Because the more generous system is the unemployment insurance benefit system, there are really quite few of young people who actually qualify for this system, because it requires some sort of essentially, in order to qualify for that, you need to have a continuous work history first, which few of these young people have. Then there is another benefit system which you get from participating in labor market programs, and here, if you haven't worked before, you can get something after 3 months of unemployment, but it's really low according to Swedish, comparing to any other system that you would find in Sweden. These benefits that you get are really low. Then, of course, you have a system which is sort of means-tested social assistance, which is the poverty protection system, which is used by some of these young people, and it's a really poorly working system precisely because it's means-tested, because that means that if you work a little bit, that's good for the municipality because they have to pay you less benefits, but it's not really good for your own economy, because as long as you're not sort of raising over the poverty line, you're sort of just working for the income from your additional work is only going to the municipality. But apart from that, transfers from the public system to these youths are fairly low, I would say. On the other hand, there might be substantial transfers from the parents of these young people. That is presumably what is going on, but at least that's not a policy issue. So the other thing is we try to do things for these young people that can sort of help them get into jobs. And here we have this sort of a mandatory program that everyone is allowed to go into, at least after 3 months of unemployment. And if you want to have benefits, you need to do it. It gives you sort of a rich set of of components with job search assistance, employment subsidies, practice programs, and labor market training programs. And the evidence that we have suggests that this is good for these young people, right? It seems to help them, at least in the short run. And this is, you could think of this as being additional support to young unemployed compared to older unemployed. So they get more resources, and these resources on average seems to be helpful. There are also additional systems that are targeted towards the young. There are, compared to other systems that we have in Sweden, very generous grants for continued schooling among these young people who have, at least those who haven't completed high school. So if you haven't completed high school, you can get a fairly generous subsidy for going back to school and completing your high school. There's across the board subsidy for firms hiring young people. So for a given nominal wage that you pay, you have about 10% lower wage costs if you hire a young person who is below 25 through lower payroll taxes. So again, a subsidy for firms to hire any young people. And you know, you should think of this, that they're sort of fairly generous, targeted tools towards helping young people. But the question is, so why do we still have a pretty pronounced youth unemployment problem in Sweden? And here I would say that these are the stories that people in general tell about why this is the case. And I think they all have some bearing on the problem. It's not super clear exactly how important each part is. But the first one is that we have an employment protection legislation which is dual, which means that we have a fairly strong protection for those who have a permanent contract, while firms have a very generous flexibility in terms of using temporary contracts. And that means that the firms who are the least bit interested in flexibility will have a fair amount of their staff on temporary contracts, and they can do that as long as they replace these workers now and again. So you can see that this creates incentives to have youth who are more willing to work on these temporary contracts and replace them now and again. The other one would be the minimum wages, which in Sweden is completely up to the social partners. Right now there is very sensitive negotiations between the social partners and the government in trying to mitigate the impact of high collectively agreed minimum wages through a system with some subsidies and lower, that would somehow lower the wage cost for the young people. We will see exactly what comes out of that, but that's a pretty remarkable thing, because otherwise wage setting is supposed to be something that the government stays out of. Then the third piece here is education. And here, one of the things that we have is a system for training young people into professions through vocational high schools that are quite academic in some sense, with very little links to employment and to employers, and where the kids are spending very little time on actual firms. So that's one part. The other part has to do with higher education. So young people in Sweden are very old when they graduate from university. On average, they're 29, the median is 27. Going from 19 to 27, these kids do a lot of things. They work, they are unemployed, they go to university. And they go back and forth between this system, which also creates a lot of these short-term spells that we see. Okay. I believe that the situation in Latvia is very different in this respect. Someone told me before. Okay, so if I'm going to very shortly talk about what can we learn from this experience, I would say that one of them is that the formal education system is very important. So the fact that, I think first of all, it's very important to realize that the fact that the low educated do very poorly doesn't necessarily mean that it's the fault of the education system. Kids with social problems or addictions or whatever, they will do poorly in school and on the labor market. It doesn't have to do with the schooling system. Okay. But the studies that we have of the type of reforms that we have seen in the 90s in Swedish high school education system really tells us that reforms that we had that were there with very, very good intentions of raising education among these kids were actually hurting the sort of low performing kids, because it was becoming too difficult to get a diploma to get into the labor market. Right? So we were adding on to the curriculum and making it harder to pass the high school system and getting a diploma, and this made it actually, so this was sort of intended to school these kids better, but it made it more difficult for some of these kids to get into the labor market. In addition, quite recent research show that if you give more resources to primary schools, these kids in the long run will actually do better on the labor market. Which is, I think, a remarkable result, which really shows that the schooling system is very important. And I think this is a change of focus that you would see in the Swedish debate, where we previously thought about the education system as providing something very general, and then it was for the active labor market policies and these different types of programs to take care of the kids if they didn't establish on the labor market. Now I think we are trying to move into a system where education is more integrated towards the labor market. And this is also my last slide here, which I think is related to that, which is that when you want to help young people establish on the labor market, providing actual contacts with actual employers is a key element. This is what we see in all sorts of evaluations we have on different types of programs, be it job search assistance, training programs, or education. And this is also what you see when you analyze the process where young people find their work. There's almost always a personal relationship between the young people and the employer somehow. And if you can provide these type of relationships, you will make this transition go much faster. And this is also, I think, an element that is going to, we're trying to push, I think, in the Swedish context towards integrating this element more. And I think this is something that we have realized fairly late, how important this process is.
Thank you very much, Oskar. So, do we have a question?